Right, so we're diving deep today into a topic you all wanted to explore further, the urban poor.
Hmm.
And we're going to be mainly drawing from Viv Grigg's Cry of the Urban Poor for this one.
Yeah.
I think what struck me just initially was the sheer scale of it all, you know?
Yeah.
It's one thing to talk about poverty as this sort of abstract concept, but when you read Grigg's work, it really hits you the immense human dimension of it.
Absolutely. And, especially when you think about it as a phenomenon that's, well, rapidly growing, this urban poverty, you see, especially in the developing world.
Right.
And Grigg, with his background, I mean, he's the international director of the Urban Leadership Foundation, right? So he's not just looking at this from an academic standpoint. He's been working in the slums, living in these communities. So his insights are incredibly valuable because they come from such a deeply, deeply human place. He's not just presenting data. He's giving us a glimpse into the lives of these diverse populations. And so for us, I think our goal in this deep dive is to go beyond a very surface level understanding and really grapple with who these individuals are, what their lives are like, and the incredible challenges they face.
It's multifaceted.
It is.
There's so many layers. And I think one of the things that Grigg does really effectively is right off the bat, he throws out this statistic, this thought experiment, really, that just kind of blows your mind. He asks us, imagine, if a major religious group, like Muslims or Hindus, were like doubling in size every single decade.
Yeah.
And not only that, but they were also particularly open to receiving, a new message.
Right.
That would be huge. It would demand, like, global attention.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly his point, right? I mean, he's saying that the population of urban squatters and slum dwellers, it's not just comparable in size, it's actually doubling roughly every 10 years.
Yeah.
And on top of that, they show significant receptivity, to positive change.
That's huge.
Yeah, and it just underscores the urgency of understanding this demographic,
Absolutely.
their growth. It's exponential.
It is. And it's so fascinating because as you dig into his work, you realize there isn't just one name for these places.
Mhm.
I mean, around the world, they're called all sorts of things. It really shows you how this is like a global phenomenon that plays out in all these different local contexts, right?
Totally. I mean, think about it, right? In Bangkok, you've got slums. In Manila, they're called squatter areas. South Africa, shanty towns. India, busties. Morocco, Bidenvilles, and it just goes on and on. Brazil, favelas, Algeria, casbahs, Venezuela, ranchitos, Mexico, ciudades perdidas, and Peru, barriadas or pueblos joven. It's really interesting to see how the terminology reflects those local nuances, but here's the important thing, right? Grigg, he often uses this like umbrella term. He calls them squatter areas a lot of the time, and he does that to kind of highlight what's shared across all these places,
We're common thread.
Exactly. They have shared experiences, similar drivers. And so I think what's key for us to grasp here is that, yeah, local solutions are important, of course.
Of course.
But there are some fundamental principles at play here that we can look at.
And the biggest driver behind all of this, I mean, it's this huge, massive wave of rural to urban migration. And the numbers are they're almost hard to comprehend.
Oh, they are. We're talking about, get this, 2 billion people moving from rural areas to cities in the last, 40 years?
40 years, yeah.
And projections say another 500 million will be making that same move over the next decade. I mean, that is an insane transformation in how humans are living on this planet.
It is. And like Grigg points out, for most of those people, the first place they end up, the first place they land in the city are those squatter areas. They become these rapidly expanding peripheries around these already really densely populated urban centers.
Right.
You can see why this is such a huge issue.
Absolutely. And Grigg, he gives us some really helpful historical context, too, so you can appreciate just how quickly all this has happened. Between 1950 and 1980, the urban population in third world megacities, it just exploded. It went from 275 million to almost a billion people.
Wow.
And then get this. By the year 2000, it had practically doubled again. It was at over 1.85 billion.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and that speed, that acceleration in such a short time frame, it puts just enormous pressure on these urban environments.
Well, and you see it so clearly in a place like Dhaka, Bangladesh.
Yeah.
A city with, over 12 million people?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have an estimated 3.5 million living in over 3,000 squatter slum areas.
Yeah.
And What really stands out there is that there isn't enough industrial growth to absorb all those people.
Right.
These people coming in, they're looking for opportunities, but the city just isn't equipped to provide them.
No.
And you see the challenges, the problems with providing housing, employment, just basic infrastructure.
Exactly.
It's a really, really tough situation.
And it's a trend, that's only going to continue. I mean, Grigg points out that practically all the future growth in the global population, it's expected to happen in cities, rural areas. Those populations are projected to stay more or less the same. So we're talking about like a fundamental shift in where people are living.
It's a whole different world that we're moving into, isn't it?
It really is.
And then there's this other factor, the rise of the megacity.
Right.
You tend to see this in a lot of countries where there's one dominant urban center. And it seems to just suck up all the resources, all the opportunities.
Yeah.
It kind of starves out the smaller cities. Like, Chiang Mai in Thailand is a good example.
Yeah.
It's 30 times smaller than Bangkok.
Right.
And that imbalance, that pull that the megacities have, it makes the problem of urban poverty even worse.
It does. It's like this massive gravitational force.
It really is.
Okay, but let's shift gears for a second. Let's talk about something that Grigg makes a really important distinction between. It's something that helps us understand how these urban poor communities actually work, He talks about the difference between what he calls slums of hope and slums of despair. And this isn't just about words, it really changes how we view these places and how we might think about interacting with them.
Yeah, and this is really key. So these slums of hope, as Grigg describes them, these are often the first settlements that people who are migrating from rural areas in search of work, in search of a better life, these are the places that they create. They'll find some land somewhere that's unoccupied, and they start building their homes. They start looking for work, and they're trying to rebuild, the communities, the bonds that they had back in their villages.
Right, and I think what makes them slums of hope, is that underlying optimism. They haven't given up. They're still striving for something better.
Yeah.
And a really big thing, that Grigg emphasizes are the social structures that are already there. It's what we sometimes call social capital.
I've heard that term.
Yeah.
What does it mean exactly?
Well, it's basically those networks of relationships. It's the mutual support you find in a community, their shared values, those kinds of things. And it's really important because it gives them a basis for acting together, for working together. It makes them more open to change, to positive influences.
So it's not just about the physical place.
No.
It's about the people and the spirit and how they connect with each other.
Exactly.
I see. So it's not like every single person living there is just destitute. There's something else there. There's a dynamism. There's this drive for something better.
Exactly. Now, on the flip side, we have the slums of despair. And these are often like places that are already run down, maybe old tenement buildings in parts of the city that were once middle class or even upper class.
Okay.
They tend to attract people who, for whatever reason, they've lost that hope. They're struggling to deal with their situation.
Makes sense.
But here's an interesting thing. You also find in these slums of despair a mix of other people, like recent immigrants who are trying to be close to where the jobs are, or students looking for cheap housing near the universities. Think of places like Sao Paulo or Lima. They've got these areas, the favelas, corticos, tugurios.
Yeah.
So a more diverse group, but maybe not the same sense of community.
Yeah, I get that. So while you might find a wider range of people in these slums of despair, what's missing is that core sense of hope, that strong community feeling you find in the slums of hope. They seem, more fragile maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
More vulnerable.
And that difference, that distinction that Grigg makes, it's really important, because he argues that the slums of hope, they're much more strategically important when it comes to, responding to the needs of those communities, when it comes to creating positive change. They already have the social cohesion, they have that shared desire for a better future, and those things, they create fertile ground for real engagement, for development efforts to actually take root and make a difference.
And to really drive home what all of this means in the real world, Grigg uses Calcutta as a case study. And it's a powerful one. I mean, Calcutta, you hear that name, you automatically think of extreme poverty.
You do. It's almost become synonymous with hardship, right? And Grigg, he starts by acknowledging that perception. He talks about how Calcutta is often seen as a place where, the powers that be, he calls them the powers of darkness.
Whoa.
Yeah, he uses some pretty strong language there. He's talking about the systems, the structures that keep people trapped in poverty.
Yeah.
And he even mentions the presence of a mafia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's intense.
it is. But then right away, he contrasts that with the title of Dominique Lapierre's novel, City of Joy.
Oh, I've heard of that book.
Yeah, and it's a really intentional choice because it highlights that even amidst all this injustice, there's incredible resilience, incredible dignity, and even moments of joy, believe it or not.
It's amazing how humans can endure.
It is. And then Grigg goes on to detail what he saw firsthand. He describes all these different levels and expressions of poverty. He talks about seeing underfed people begging with babies, amputees, and even, sadly, people dying on the streets. It's a very raw, very visceral picture of what absolute destitution looks like.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine.
And, he backs all of this up with statistics from the 1980s. Hundreds of thousands officially unemployed. Potentially as many as 1 million young people with degrees registered at employment exchanges, which tells you that there just aren't enough jobs. And the number of people begging on the streets, well, it was unlike anything else seen in India at the time. It was staggering.
Wow.
But then there's this other group, too, a significant population living permanently on the streets. Estimates at the time were anywhere from 48,000 to 200,000 people. What's surprising, though, and it speaks to how resourceful people can be in these situations, is that most of them, like 2/3, had some kind of regular job, even if it was just selling little things, vegetables, paper, firewood, that kind of thing. Only about 20% were just begging.
I guess when you have to survive, you find a way. And you mentioned the 1980s. It's important to note that back then, over half the population of metropolitan Calcutta, about 3.5 million people, were living in slums. Most families, about 2/3, were earning below the poverty line. And what's also interesting is that the main sources of employment were agriculture and small-scale crafts, not really large-scale industry. So there wasn't a lot of economic development happening.
Right. And Grigg also talks about the poverty of those approaching death, which is a really powerful phrase. He describes what he saw very poignantly. He talks about the blank stare of an old man, about all the people sleeping on the sidewalks, and about a mother shivering, desperately trying to find medicine for her kids who were severely malnourished.
Those images are just heartbreaking.
They are. And Grigg doesn't just stop there. He also talks about the future, what all of this means going forward. He's particularly concerned about the high birth rates in these poverty-stricken communities. He predicts that in the future, there will be even more people leaving the rural areas because there just won't be enough land to support them. As the land gets divided up more and more, it becomes harder to farm, harder to make a living. And what's really interesting is that he says even if agricultural productivity goes up, it might not actually solve the problem.
How so?
Well, it might mean more people migrating to the cities because life in the rural areas might not improve all that much, even if more crops are being produced.
It's a complex issue.
Oh, it absolutely is. And he also talks about the political climate in Bengal at the time, the economic instability, and the fact that the caste system and some traditional cultural norms were playing a role in keeping this cycle of poverty going.
It's like a perfect storm of factors.
Yeah, and Calcutta becomes this multi-layered, stark example of how complex urban poverty really is in these developing countries.
And I think it leads us to a really fundamental question, which is, how do we even understand poverty in the first place? Because there are these two concepts, absolute poverty and relative poverty. They're different, and they offer very different perspectives.
Absolutely. And Grigg really breaks those down for us. He says absolute poverty is, well, when you just don't have the basic things you need to survive.
Like the bare minimum.
Exactly.
Sure.
Food, clothing, shelter. When you don't have enough of those things, you're talking about malnutrition, disease, and potentially even starving to death. It's just about staying alive and healthy.
Right.
Now, relative poverty, that's a bit different. It's when you compare how well someone's living or how well a family is living to others in their community or in their country.
So it's about your standard of living compared to everyone else around you.
Exactly. And a lot of times it has to do with being marginalized, with being excluded from opportunities. Like, for example, not owning a car in a place like Auckland, New Zealand. Now, you're not going to die because you don't have a car, but it can make it really hard to get to work, to access services, to be part of social activities. And so you end up feeling poor compared to everyone else.
It's all relative, isn't it?
It is. And what's important to understand is that the poverty you see in these third world squatter areas, it's usually absolute poverty. And it's happening on a scale that you just don't see in Western countries. Grigg makes this really striking comparison. He says that the middle class in Calcutta are actually poorer than the poor in Los Angeles.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
It is. It makes you really think about the level of deprivation we're talking about here.
And the interesting thing, too, and Grigg points this out, is that poverty, the way we define it, it changes depending on historical context, and depending on the standards of the society you're talking about. Someone who's considered poor in Manila today might have actually been better off than, say, the middle class in England 400 years ago.
Huh.
But because technology's advanced, expectations have changed, living standards have risen, they're still considered poor by today's standards.
That's a really good point.
It's all about the context.
And Grigg even goes further than that. He talks about a broader definition of poverty. He connects it to not having a vision for the future, not having a sense of what a reasonable or even an ideal lifestyle could look like. And he brings in this idea of shalom, which is a Hebrew word. It basically means peace, but it's a much deeper kind of peace. It's the peace that comes from living in a just society, in a secure society. So he's saying that poverty isn't just about not having enough money or possessions. It's also about not having a sense of well-being, of belonging to a community that's thriving.
It's a more holistic way of looking at it, isn't it?
It is. And then Grigg gives us this really helpful comparison. He lays out the key features of poverty as they appear in the first world versus the third world. And it shows us that there are some pretty big differences in where poverty comes from, how it looks, and how people experience it.
Like, what are some of those differences?
Well, in the first world, people living in poverty, they're often a smaller percentage of the population.
Right.
And they face a lot of discrimination, a lot of stigma. It's tough for them to move up in society, to improve their situation. There aren't as many job opportunities, and it's hard to find permanent work, a steady job. And sometimes, they end up relying on welfare, which is what Grigg calls secure poverty. They're not going to starve, but they're also not really able to get ahead.
It's a catch-22.
Yeah, it really is. Now, in the third world, poverty often affects a much larger percentage of the population, and it can happen to people from all different backgrounds, lower classes, even middle classes, if they experience like an economic shock or if there just aren't any opportunities for them.
I see. So the origins are different.
Right, and the way people work is different too. In the third world, labor is often much more flexible. People are constantly adapting, and a lot of times they're creating their own jobs, even if those jobs are informal or don't pay very much. They have to be resourceful just to survive.
That's what he calls self-inflationary employment generation.
Exactly. They have to create their own opportunities.
It's about survival.
It is, and that's their daily focus. They're not necessarily thinking about moving up in the world. They're just thinking about how to get through the day.
It's a completely different reality.
It really is. And this comparison, I think it really highlights how different the systemic factors are in those two different contexts.
Right.
And how people's day-to-day lives are completely different.
It makes a lot of sense.
Now, remember what we were talking about earlier, the whole idea of slums of hope.
Yeah.
Well, Grigg emphasizes that these areas are the most strategically important places for anyone who wants to create positive change. And it's precisely because of that hope. Because they already have those community structures in place, and because they have the shared desire for a better future, those things, they make those communities much more receptive to change, to outside help.
So they're not just like passively waiting for things to get better. They're actively trying to make things better.
Exactly. And Grigg, he brings in a spiritual dimension to all of this, too. He quotes Jesus, where he says that eternal life is knowing God. And Grigg acknowledges, that to really address the root causes of poverty, you need more than just material solutions. You need things like aid, development projects, community organizing, even political action.
Yeah, it's multifaceted.
But he's also saying that there needs to be a deeper transformation, something that happens at the level of the individual and the community. And he uses the example of Francis Xavier, who believed that real change, lasting change, comes through grace and faith.
Okay.
It's a recognition that sometimes, it takes more than just changing the material circumstances. You have to change hearts and minds, too.
You have to change people from the inside out.
Exactly. And Grigg concludes by calling for what he calls movements of the righteous, people who are committed to actually transforming these cities, to making a real difference in the lives of the urban poor. And he stresses that understanding poverty, understanding all its complexities, that's the first step to creating and sustaining these movements.
So to kind of bring all of this together, all of these ideas from Viv Grigg's work, as we come to the end of this deep dive into the urban poor, There are a few key things that I think really stand out. First, the sheer scale of urban poverty in the developing world.
Yes.
It's huge, and it's growing all the time. It's a defining issue of our time.
Absolutely.
And then there's that important distinction that Grigg makes between slums of hope and slums of despair.
Right.
It gives us this really valuable way of looking at these communities, of understanding their internal dynamics, and of figuring out how to support them in ways that are actually effective.
And we can't forget the example of Calcutta. It's this vivid, often very moving picture of what extreme poverty really looks like. But it also reminds us of how resilient people are, how resourceful they can be, even in the face of such incredible adversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that's really important to remember is that poverty isn't just this one-dimensional thing. It's not just about not having enough money. We have to think about both absolute poverty, that lack of basic necessities, and relative poverty, that sense of being excluded, of not having the same opportunities as everyone else. And we also have to think about poverty in a more holistic way, like Grigg talks about, thinking about the well-being of the community as a whole, not just the material circumstances.
Right. And when we compare poverty in the first world and the third world, it really underscores just how different the challenges are, how different the lived experiences are.
Absolutely. But in the end, I think Grigg's focus on those slums of hope, it's really a hopeful message. It tells us that there are places where change is possible, where communities are ready and willing to work towards a better future. It gives individuals and organizations a place to start, a way to make a real, lasting difference.
Absolutely. And so with that, I think we have a question for you, the listener. Considering everything we've talked about today, the massive movement of people from rural areas to cities, all the different faces of poverty, what do you think are the most effective and the most ethical ways for individuals and for whole societies to engage with these complex realities? It's a huge question, and the consequences are immense. But reflecting on these ideas, thinking deeply about them, that's a crucial part of trying to understand and address this global challenge.
We need to keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.
This can't end here.
Yeah.